Hi, everyone at Multiplay Conference. Welcome to our talk. My name is Daz. My pronouns are they, them.
And I'm Sarah, and my pronouns are she, they.
And we are the co-founders of Game Assist, which is a multi-platform, multimedia project looking at liberation and accessibility in gaming and political education through video games. And today we're going to be delivering a talk on education as revolutionary practice.
Okay, so to start with, let's talk about education and what that formally means. A lot of you guys here today are undoubtedly involved in academia, whether that's in research, teaching, or as a student, and myself and Daz were both students as well, not that long ago. When it comes to games, as like everyone knows, and I'm sure I'm rehashing things a bit, but do bear with me. Games haven't necessarily always been recognized as something worthy of serious academic discipline or pursuit, something worth recognizing as art or studying as art, or indeed studying in other ways, like in terms of political economy or digital economy, for example.
Or therapeutic practice, even.
Yeah, like in various ways that there are to study games that haven't necessarily been kind of considered formally within academia or within the formal education system until pretty recently, I think. That partly comes as no surprise because gaming is quite a new medium, like even more so than film, which is, something that's taken a bit more seriously as an academic discipline and has been since the late 20th century. But that is something that is clearly starting to happen now and has over the past few decades. There's more of a move now to recognize gaming as something that should be seen as a serious academic discipline, no matter what angle, including the ones that we've mentioned, you're studying it from. I certainly never thought that I would be in the situation that we're in today, where we're at a conference giving a very serious talk about games, where the whole purpose of the day is kind of considering games as worthy of serious academic study. As recently as, I suppose it was 2014 now, when I was applying to for my undergraduate degree in English literature, and I interviewed at Cambridge University. Admittedly, was very ill prepared for that interview, but in any case, one of the many segments of that grueling interview was specifically about my personal statement. And in my personal statement, kind of at that time, even so when I was like 17, I had mentioned video games and graphic novels as areas that, I thought were worthy of academic study through that lens of textual analysis, through the lens of the study of literature and texts. And very vividly remember my interviewer not taking that seriously at all, kind of ridiculing the idea that digital media, that games could be, worthy of academic study or worthwhile academic pursuits. And I think that probably had more of a lasting impact on me than I would think. I mean, I think that there was part of me that rejected that for sure and kind of thought like, oh, I don't know if this is the place for me, with its kind of rigid traditional understanding of what literature is and what the study of literature means. But I think that there was probably also part of me that kind of accepted that because of the way that we accept certain individuals and institutions having superior knowledge to us. So I certainly never thought that I would be where I am today.
It's definitely an interesting situation that we found ourselves in. And there's definitely some overwhelmingly positive aspects of gaming and like video games being viewed as art in an academic discipline setting. For one, it gives us more sources to refer to when we're making our video essays. People are already doing the writing on video games.
Definitely. And I think that when we started out this project, which we're kind of going to talk more about what exactly we do at Game Assist later, but when we started out, I honestly never knew or thought that that would be the case. And just in the past kind of year or so of us doing this, I think we've both been so like pleasantly surprised by the like depth and breadth of study of games that there is out there, like whether that's through kind of formal academic institutions or through just kind of what people are saying about games through kind of media outlets, journalism, blogs, videos, all sorts, like Reddit,
the hellscape of Twitter.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. While there are those positive aspects for sure, and part of the reason, that we're here, that all of us are here today, is because we see the value in studying games and studying gaming. There are also some tensions that need to be kind of reconciled when we think about the study of games as an academic discipline. The academy is inaccessible and violent, as it says on the slide. What does that mean? That means a lot of things in the UK context and globally. Within the UK context, kind of to start, just because that's where we're based, and both Daz and myself kind of work within students' unions and within formal education in this country. The UK education system was founded and continues to perpetuate profit-driven colonial violence, like in this country and abroad, especially since the last 10, I guess it's 12 years now in this country. The encroaching marketization of education has been turning universities into businesses, with, the profit motive kind of increasingly at the center of decisions that are made about how the university is structured, where it spends its funding, etc. So this kind of results in an institution that prioritizes profit over the needs and the well-being of its students and staff, institutions that invest in the global arms trade, in fossil fuels that are inaccessible physically, that are inaccessible digitally, that perpetuate trauma against students, whether that's, through student staff misconduct, whether it's through policing and securitization on campus, whether it's through the way in which the lived experiences of students, especially students of color and other marginalized students on campuses, are belittled. So there are just manifold ways that, physically, economically, and emotionally and personally, that our education system perpetuates violence, particularly against, vulnerable and marginalized people. So the academy is very much part of kind of the state violence that we face in this country, and as I've alluded to, is very much linked to violence globally. So the question that emerges from acknowledging the violence that our education system perpetuates, while also, kind of finding interest and joy and so forth in the study of games, and the fact that the study of games is something which is being taken more seriously within academia, we find ourselves in a position where we have to reconcile and confront those tensions. How do we study games? How do we kind of use games for good, I guess, in that context?
Fundamentally, everyone who's at this conference, like not just us, must have some acknowledgement that the games industry itself is also inaccessible and violent. There are similarities between the way that the particularly AAA games industry functions and the way that the academy functions. And everyone at this conference wants games to be better in some way. That's why we're here. So in terms of the games industry being inaccessible and violent, getting into gaming, if you are anyone who is not a straight cis white man, can be very difficult, whether that's games journalism, programming, PR, anything related to games making. It's a very exclusionary environment. And the AAA gaming industry is actively violent in similar ways to the way that the academy is violent. We discussed in a piece that we made earlier in 2021 about decolonization that lots of tech companies are actively involved in funding arms technology and in particularly funding the Israeli occupation of Palestine. These companies are actively perpetuating violence, as well as what some violent ideology of games promotes. For example, arms companies making deals with games developers to show their particular gun in a positive light is something that is fairly common.
I think that that's a really interesting point of parallel, right? Of the way that both the academy and the games industry are directly kind of materially and economically and physically involved in global neo-colonial violence through kind of the ideology that's promoted in the academy and through games, through kind of material investment that our universities or, you know, local councils and pension funds have in arms companies and fossil fuels, and also in the way that our academies have, you know, research partnerships, careers partnerships with arms companies, fossil fuel companies, and again, completely similar in games, like to take the examples of how companies like Microsoft and Hewlett Packard are directly developing software and hardware for military tanks, for surveillance, for all this kind of thing. So there are really strong parallels in that sense between this kind of violence that the games industry materially and ideologically perpetuates and the violence that the academy perpetuates. So again, it brings us back to that question: how do we kind of critique and study games in the games industry and the very things that we're talking about within the context of the academy, and how do we kind of navigate those tensions and navigate ultimately our own complicity in that?
Something that can be interesting to look at when considering the sort of different paths that people take in the games industry is looking at people who have got into gaming through formal education, for example, going to university for computer programming or games design, and where they end up going on to work, and then people who make indie games. Because as we'll go on to discuss in a bit, indie game development in itself is one of the ways in which we can sort of disrupt the AAA academy, as we have come to call it. Because a lot of higher education establishments, in the same way that they have these deals with arms companies and like tech companies and fossil fuels, will have industry relations with large developers. And many people who go through formal education for gaming will end up working for these big corporations, the ones that are often perpetuating the most harm. These corporations employ a lot of different tactics to, you know, treat their workers terribly. We hear constantly about game development crunch, about people who work for large studios not even knowing what game they're working on, about terrible pay, and of course the most recent Activision Blizzard scandal around sexual assault and other gender-based violence. Whereas indie developers who make some of, in my opinion, the most interesting games on the market currently, are often self-taught, and what they produce usually challenges the established sort of gaming canon and is usually focused around uplifting voices of marginalized groups. So a lot of game developers will tell queer stories, will tell stories of refugees or of disabled people. And it's the stuff that we don't see coming out of the AAA companies that is going against the ideology that is constantly being spouted to try and bring something new from gaming.
Yeah, and kind of the experimentalism of indie game developers in terms of kind of like the formal qualities of games is so exciting as well, because it raises these very questions which kind of cycle back into the mainstream every so often of what makes a video game and what a video game can do, and it kind of brings to question these ideas of what we have perhaps kind of normalized or taken for granted as valuable within games. And I think that the way that the experimentalism of indie games kind of does that and has the potential to do that, as well as kind of renegotiating what it looks like to work in games and renegotiating those relationships of kind of care and like collectivity and cooperation, as opposed to kind of the alienated relations of labor that exist to such a large degree within the AAA gaming industry. It kind of very much parallels, again, situations within the academy and within formal education. You know, partly because in formalized education practice, we prescribe value to knowledge in very particular ways, in ways which are gendered and racialized and classed, you know, in ways that exclude and devalue certain forms of knowledge, of Indigenous knowledges or oral knowledges, of knowledges gained outside of the academy, etc. So often kind of alternative educational practices, whether that's kind of through communities, weekend schools, blogs, podcasts, all sort of alternative educational practices that people do can, in the same way that the experimentalism of indie games does kind of raise those questions of how we assign value to what knowledge is, to what education is, and to what games are, to what narratives are, and to what stories are, and also kind of brings into play those relationships of work and labor and care that are at play kind of within both of those arenas. So all of these kind of very chaotic musings bring us on to the question of education as revolutionary practice. How we, as we've said, navigate those tensions between the study of games and the violence of the academy, and how we can perhaps kind of conceive of games studies and games education in different ways, in different practices. And we'll kind of get on to what Game Assist does and how we kind of practice that I feel like practice that kind of to what we do than I sometimes feel. I feel like there is a lot of intentionality to what we do, but also we're just figuring things out as much as anyone else. But for me personally, I see that as part of kind of revolutionary practice, is that it's something that's, generative,
Yeah.
In any case.
We are evolving.
Yeah. Bell Hooks famously describes education as the practice of freedom. She says that in the classroom, it was crucial for her and for every other student to be an active participant. And she said that education connects the will to know with the will to become. Learning is a place, in her opinion, where paradise can be created. So she said that a lot better than I just did. This gives us a really good starting point to start to think about the forms that education as revolutionary practice can take before, talking about it specifically with regards to game studies. Some famous examples of kind of what Bell Hooks describes, and her own work was certainly part of this tradition. We can think of the practice of the Black Panther Party based in the United States, and the way that local chapters of the Black Panther Party provided supplementary schools in local Black communities. The kind of historical materialist and radical anti-racist politics of the party kind of shaped them in a way that they weren't a political party in the sense of formal party politics, but saw real value in education in the community, as well as other forms of work within the community, like weekly breakfasts, Sunday breakfasts, and stuff like that. Kind of further to that tradition, and something a little bit closer to home for us in the UK, although this is definitely relevant abroad as well, is the way that teach outs have been a prominent part of UCU strikes, definitely in the past few years, definitely as long as we've been around and involved in student politics.
As you can see from these beautiful photos of us doing the thing.
So both Daz and I went to the University of Manchester, and we both studied there. And kind of when we were students, how many strikes happened while we were students?
Yeah, there was definitely a good few. Like, I think the main ones for me was when I was in second year, but I believe there was like maybe 2 or 3 whilst you were a student. And then, of course, there's the ones that are currently ongoing.
Yeah. For me, the sort of solidarity, like staff-student solidarity and energy and creativity that emerges from strikes is absolutely incredible. And kind of like this takes various forms. One of the forms that it takes is that I think that in the classroom and kind of within formal education, for me, because of the way that it's structured, I always definitely felt this kind of divide between staff and students, particularly academic staff. And I think that the environment of the strike really dissolved, not in a problematic way, but in a
in like a
useful
cooperative way.
In
Yeah.
a useful way, in a cooperative way. It kind of dissolved those boundaries between staff and students, in the sense that, you know, in a formal kind of classroom setting, because of the structure of our education and the structure of those classrooms, a lot of the time we kind of have this idea that a lecturer or a teacher or whomever, whether it's in a university or a school or what have you, is an arbiter of knowledge, and a student is kind of a vessel to receive and absorb knowledge. In the setting of and the environment of the strikes, I definitely kind of felt that dissolve. We were on equal footing, and I always felt like, you know, I had knowledge and could impart knowledge as much as staff could, and it kind of felt like everyone shared knowledge in a way that was just more collective and more, although I loathe to use the word for various reasons, democratic way. So, you know, that's definitely kind of one of the first things that comes to mind for me. And I think that this extends, you know, inevitably to teaching practice in most of the strikes that we were a part of, as well as kind of showing solidarity by being at picket lines and kind of sharing knowledge and care and emotional labor through our presence at the picket lines, through kind of acts of bringing food to people striking on picket lines, all sorts of wonderful ways of expressing solidarity. The spaces that were created in so-called teach outs were just always like super exciting and open and kind of generative. So in a lot of the teach outs I went to, sometimes students and activist groups and stuff were leading those teach outs and kind of like facilitating those teach outs, and, you know, disrupting that idea that knowledge only exists within the academy and that knowledge is only valuable within the academy. So it was like, students have knowledge, activist groups have knowledge, the community has knowledge, and we all kind of came together to share that on equal footing. A lot of the time, the format of the space as well was like a lot more open. I know that the image of me on this slide is like standing in front of a group of people doesn't feel like it conveys it that well, but
But no, I know what you mean. Like often in some of these teach outs, we'd be sort of all sat in a circle, and whoever was leading the session was part of the group, and it felt a lot more collaborative and like you could bounce off of each other. And another great thing about teach outs was that some academics did also lead sessions, and they were able to teach on things that they might have personal interest in, but the rigid and like old-fashioned structure of the academy does not allow them to explore that within their classes. And so there was just like such a vast array of knowledge from a huge amount of different people. And it was just always a really nice space to be a part of.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, we were always asking each other questions and teaching each other and challenging each other in productive ways. And I don't know, like a lot of the time when I was in those teach out spaces, like whatever position I had kind of within that space, I always felt excited by it and energized by it, because it feels like, I suppose, education is revolutionary practice. Like within that space, I thought, you know, this is what learning and education can be in the way that bell hooks imagined it as paradise. Because that violence of the academy, which I mean, we've talked a lot about kind of the material violence of the academy, but that violence of the academy that you face within the classroom is definitely something that, like, I know that I struggled with a lot, particularly as a racialized person. You know, even thinking about kind of the structures of the academy within a marketized system, within a capitalist system, where the academy essentially first and foremost serves the purpose of creating laborers for capital, right? That imperative, that capitalist imperative on education didn't exist within these spaces, right?
No.
Like this was a space that felt like a moment, felt like a taste of the kind of revolutionary future, I suppose, that we envision.
It's learning for learning's sake.
Learning for learning's sake, and learning as inherently connected to action.
Mm-hmm.
So learning as a revolutionary practice, really, I think that phrase is really apt because it's about, it centers this idea that learning and practice can be the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that we don't have to be 100% complicit. I mean, obviously, like in our circumstances, there's always a question of complicity to navigate, but there's kind of an undermining of the formalistic idea of education as serving capital, and instead education was serving community and solidarity and care and revolution and anti-capitalist action. And those were the things that I think were really embodied in the strikes and in the tea chats especially.
And that's kind of what we try to do. Game Assist as a project, we very much sort of try and work with that idea of education as revolutionary practice. Like, fundamentally, what we are aiming to do is create a space for education, not just us educating other people, but other people educating us, all of us learning together, and then also using that to do revolutionary practice, like put in the work to do actual calls to action. A lot of the stuff that we do revolves around organizing and letting people know where they can sort of put their time and energy and funds, if appropriate, to help out with causes that they may not have known about. So we are, in a similar way to how the teach outs and strikes kind of function both inside and outside of the academy at the same time, we are kind of trying to work both inside and outside the games industry, using industry relations to sort of get to, you know, places like this and get involved in other larger projects to try and influence the industry. The main thing that we do is create video essays that sort of provide a textual analysis of video games from a political perspective. We use video games as case studies to allow people to contextualize and understand complex political theory, because it can be dry and it can be really hard to understand. But video games is something that is becoming more and more accessible to people, whether that's actually being able to play the games themselves or whether it's watching streamers or YouTubers. People are engaging with video games, and so we can use that as a medium to help people understand social and political terminology and ideology. We try to do a lot of participatory actions as well. Like, we've relatively recently started streaming on Twitch, which of course has its own problems being a Amazon-owned company. But we also do premieres of our video essays, and having these sort of live participatory modes allow us to learn from our viewers. The people in chat will frequently point out things about games that we may have not noticed or that we didn't know, and we can then go and do further reading. And as a community, we find that we're often learning together, and it's just like a really great feeling.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the time it's interesting because, like, I think that we're probably, and we'll kind of get more into perhaps how we're perceived by others shortly. But I think that obviously the most notorious thing that we do, for lack of a better word, is the video essays. Video essays are obviously an interesting format for a lot of reasons. I think that we've chosen them because, you know, they're accessible and you can kind of go into a lot of depth in ways that you can't necessarily, like in a 1,000 word article that I pitch to Polygon. But also I don't need to be doing a PhD, which, like, I'm sure has its benefits and its downfalls. It's an accessible format for a lot of people, partly more so because of the fact that so many academic essays are behind paywalls, or like books can be expensive and like all sorts of things, whereas this is like completely free. And that format is really great, but you know, I think that perhaps one of the more problematic or troubling aspects of it sometimes can be this pressure, I suppose, with any kind of like essay or even written piece or anything like that, to have some like a finished product, I suppose. Like, it's certainly something that I kind of struggle with creating video essays, is that I always feel this pressure to kind of have a finished product, which of course is not a helpful idea for this kind of generative or collaborative political practice and revolutionary practice that we're talking about. And I definitely kind of, feel the way that capitalist and academic norms have been internalized for me when I'm working on those video essays. But I kind of increasingly am trying to think of them as I kind of think that anyone should think about any given piece of writing or literature or analysis or whatever, is that it's kind of a product of that historical moment, that moment of who you are, what you know, what your positionality is, what the discourse is, all sorts of factors that kind of create that video essay as like a historical moment, so that I can kind of have compassion for myself when I'm looking back and being like, oh, I wish I'd said this or I wish I'd said that. But like, if anything, people kind of commenting on our videos and watching our videos and being like, oh, have you considered this, or I don't necessarily agree with that, or like whatever, helps to think about it less as kind of like a finished piece and more as something that we put out there to kind of encourage discussion and so forth, in the same way that we engage with the game texts, right? Like we engage with the game text as like this awesome thing or not so awesome thing has been put out there, that we kind of want to generate like this discussion and this discourse and this dialectic from. And I think that, like, for me, that's kind of what I want our video essays to be. But kind of the other stuff that we do with Let's Plays and streaming, I think is interesting in its own way, though, because we think it's useful and we think it's a useful resource, perhaps precisely for the reason that we kind of react to the game in terms of our feelings and thoughts and knowledge in that particular moment, and that we kind of express those thoughts and those feelings about the text, and we might kind of develop them later on. People in comments might develop them, people in chat might develop them. It kind of goes in all sorts of interesting and generative and unfinished directions. And I kind of think that more and more so, that kind of unfinished and iterative quality of what comes out of our like streaming and Let's Plays can be really enjoyable.
The joy of making things like video essays is that it doesn't have to be finished and we can always come back and make another one. Like, just because we have made a video about a certain topic in relation to a certain game doesn't mean that we can't then make 6 more video essays covering various other topics in Life is Strange.
Wow, I've been read.
Or that there isn't more to say, that we won't come back in 2 years and be like, you know what, the research has changed, the discourse has changed, this is what we think about it now. And we are, using the games themselves as a way of framing this, whether it's like if we're looking at how a particular thing has been portrayed in a game. So for example, I did a video essay on Honey Pop, which is a sort of notorious anime porn game. And in this video essay, I explored ideas of misogyny, racism and misogynoir, and also the treatment of sex workers, just sort of very briefly. And I received a comment on it. The gist of the comment was basically, it's just a porn game, nobody cares, like, why are you reading so much into this? And that's not why we do what we do. I know that Honey Pop is just a porn game and that it's not meant to be that deep, but it's a way that I can explore and explain society's attitudes towards women and women of color and sex workers in a way that can be understood by people who know what the game is. It acts as a reflective surface for society. These characters wouldn't have been written in this way if it wasn't for something else going on in the wider world.
Yeah, it's such a good example, because like, what does it mean to say that something, and I guess we've kind of like raised it already with the discourse of kind of like what constitutes a video game and stuff, but what does it mean to say that something is just a video game? Because like, kind of as Daz has described, Honey Pop is being kind of used by us as a resource to kind of engage people with certain issues, but also like Honey Pop is kind of again like a historically constituted moment, right? That carries historically constituted meaning about gender, about race, about economy, about consent and coercion and all sorts of things. Oh, so what does it mean to kind of say that Honey Pop is like just a game when there's clearly so much more to it than that? kind of on this idea of using Honeypop or using any game as a resource, I guess that for us, kind of the work that we do isn't just about textual analysis, kind of for the sake of unpacking what is at play kind of within the text, you know, because of the nature of what we do, particularly in kind of like a racialized, gendered, sexualized way and so forth, but also to use, I suppose, that textual analysis as a tool for political education. So it isn't just a case of analyzing video games as text from a political perspective, but also kind of using those as resources to explain political concepts and political theory that, you know, as we mentioned before, can be dry or inaccessible or difficult to read or difficult to afford for a whole host of reasons for people, and kind of discussing those in an accessible way. So, for example, our most recent video essay, I think, was a study of kind of the concept of justice within video games, and we kind of used a few case studies, and I used some case studies to work through ideas articulated by Foucault in Discipline and Punish and Angela Davis in Are Prisons Obsolete and The Meaning of Freedom. Reading Discipline and Punish wasn't necessarily like fun and engaging in and of itself, except for the fact that I am a huge nerd and I care a lot about prison abolition and abolition in general as a framework. But if you make a video talking about video games, which, you know, loads of people enjoy, you know, talking about games that a lot of people have played as well, like Dragon Age or The Last of Us Part 2, and taking those and kind of using those as a way to discuss ideas of kind of prison abolition or carceral justice and so forth, I think is a really like useful practice of education, because it's engaging and it's relevant and it's fun.
And we try and do our best to like give our viewers all the tools that they need going into the video essay to understand. Obviously, like we put a lot of work into these essays and like spend a lot of time researching and like reading these like very heavy texts often, but our video essays come as sort of a complete package so that people go into it, are introduced to a concept that they may not have heard about, learn about the key ideas and definitions, and then immediately put those ideas into practice in reference to video games that they may have played or watched or heard about.
I think that in the way that Daz has framed it, we hope that it's a good way of putting someone in a position to, from that point, kind of engage with those ideas more, instead of to just be like, yes, I agree 100% with everything that you said.
As we kind of alluded to before, due to the nature of what we do, and also sort of who we are and who we are perceived as on the internet, there are some pitfalls and misunderstandings of what we aim to do. One interesting one is people thinking that we make theory videos. Our video essays are, you know, what you would call a reading of a text. It's not a theory video. We're not trying to figure out the hidden lore and plot of a game. We are simply reading what is presented to us with a particular angle and drawing conclusions from what is given to us. We are not MatPat. We are not here to do game theory. As
much as we've talked about how there is a lot of positives to being on YouTube, there are definitely downsides to it. And that is one of the downsides, because YouTube as a platform, the kind of content that is on there that pertains to games is overwhelmingly theory videos, reviews, that kind of thing. So I think that when it comes to video essays, that's definitely one of the struggles. I think the kind of stuff that we do is something that someone goes to like JSTOR to find a lot of the time, you know, not to YouTube. And then there's the comment section.
Yeah, it's sort of a two-pronged approach here, in that the first is that the internet and the way that YouTube accounts work has created this sort of platform of anonymity. So people on the internet feel that they can be mean because they are hiding behind a username. And so frequently, a lot of the comments that we get engaging with our content is not actually critically engaging with our content at all. It's just ripping on us for daring to consider some of these topics. There's frequently quite a lot of snowflake comments. And then there's also this other side that people who have neutral views on a video or positive views on a video don't tend to post comments. People are far more likely to post a comment on a video if they have a negative or trolling opinion. So it can be really hard to get a sense of whether the work that we're doing is impactful, because the people who do critically engage with our work might not be saying so on the YouTube videos. There are some people who do, and they are absolutely wonderful, and we love to read their comments. It's great to see the thoughts that people are taking away, the things that they agree with, the things they don't quite agree with, the extra information they may have. And we really appreciate those comments when they come, because sadly they are quite rare. But I guess that's where other platforms on the internet come in, where we get feedback on the work that we do through social media, through when we're streaming, because a lot of the work we do can be branded as sort of social justice work. We attract a lot of angry people, which can be hard to see if the work that we are doing is making a difference.
Yeah, and I think that my closing thoughts on that would be that what we kind of do within GA, and I mean, there's also a sense in which, when we started, this wasn't necessarily what we had in mind, and this is kind of what it's become. And I think that that's really cool and really exciting. And
yeah,
as kind of Daz and I say to most people we encounter, like, as much as we love it, we definitely don't see it as us. We see it as like two people isn't a collective, but
it's bigger than us, and we want it to be bigger than us.
Yeah, so I think that if for any reason one of us couldn't do it anymore, or if more people came on board kind of in a more involved sense than our existing community, but like in the more involved sense that we are, then that would be amazing. This has definitely been a process for us, and something that we kind of like learn on the job about all the time, and that it's brought us to places like this. It's brought us to people like you, and that's probably been one of the most amazing parts of it for me. I think that you thinking about and discussing some of the things that we've just discussed in terms of our like learnings and our considerations about how we do the work that we do at the moment even is really interesting, because again, that kind of comes from a very particular historical moment, which is the coronavirus pandemic.
Yes.
I think that a big part of the reason why a lot of the work that we've done has taken the shape that it has is because of the situation that we've all been in, isolating at home and so forth. So what could GA look like in other ways on other platforms, offline as well as online? All very exciting questions to ask.
Thank you to Steph for having us. That's kind of the end of our discussion. If you fancy checking out some of the stuff that we do, then here's some links. We produce most of our content on YouTube. We also stream on Twitch. I forgot to put that on there, but it's GameAssistYT, same as like the majority of our handles. Yeah, we're hoping to continue to do some really cool stuff in 2022, and this has been a really great way to kick off our year. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. If there are any questions, now is the time to ask them. Future for me, but I guess present for them. Daz will be there to answer any questions you may have. Goodbye from me.